Does the plaintiff have any further witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Dr. Campbell Solo to the stand. Good afternoon, Dr. Solo. Would you begin by introducing yourself to the jury?
Sure. Hi there. My name is Campbell Solo. I'm a practicing forensic psychologist here in Midlands.
Dr. Solo, can you tell us why you're here today?
Sure. I was brought on by the plaintiffs and their attorneys to evaluate, from a forensic psychological perspective, whether or not Jesse Duran was at risk for violent behavior. And then from there, I was tasked with determining what steps or lack thereof the parent, Hayden Duran, made.
Well, before we go into those conclusions, I'd like the jury to know a little bit more about you.
Okay.
Would you begin by just telling us where you went to school?
Sure. I got my bachelor's in psychology from the University of Oregon, and then I went to the University of Michigan to get my medical doctorate. From there, I did my residency at St. Mary's University in Wisconsin, and that's where I kind of began my specialty in adolescent psychiatry and forensic psychology.
When you mentioned a term there, forensic psychology, would you explain to the jury just exactly what it is to do forensic psychology?
Sure. Forensic psychology is actually the bridge between just general therapeutic psychology, much of what you might understand, a big leather couch and talking to helping people. And the next part of that bridge is the legal system. I work very frequently with members of the criminal justice system, whether it's district attorneys, regular attorneys, judges, and being able to explain information from a psychological perspective to jury members such as yourself.
Do you yourself have a specialty within this field of forensic psychology?
Yes, my research and my specialization has consisted around adolescent forensic psychology. So that just means that bridge between, while also specializing in psychological disorder with children from the ages of 5 to 17.
So when you're beginning an evaluation, like the one you conducted in today's case, what's the first thing that you do? Do you have people coming into your office to talk to you about their problems, or
No.
how do you begin?
No. Forensic psychology doesn't exactly work like that. It's not the big comfortable leather couch like I mentioned, and it's very rare that we have the opportunity to actually talk to the person in question. My method and what's practiced in forensic psychology is more after the fact. I look at testimony, often witness statements from people involved in the legal matter, as well as doing independent research of my own to help get a better picture of what happened and then apply psychological methodology in order to determine if they were at risk for psychological disorder.
In today's case, what sort of research did you do?
I first gathered, submitted witness statements to the court, most importantly those being the affidavit of Miss Andy Park and also Miss Hayden Duran. I also looked at the witness statement from Danny Brooks, the frequent babysitter of the children. And then after that, I evaluated various exhibit evidence, things like disciplinary reports of the child in question, things they might have drawn, correspondence of the parents, anything that helps me understand if the child was at risk.
Were you yourself able to interview them?
No, I was not.
Does that in any way impact the ability you had to come to conclusions?
No. Like I mentioned a second ago, it's a reality forensic psychologists have to kind of accept. Because the legal system has a safe check in there to prevent people from exposing themselves to criminal liability, it's very common that in the forensic psychology discipline, we don't have that opportunity. So the field has developed research methods that can circumvent that hurdle and allow us to come to conclusions without actually having to talk to the person.
So, Dr. Solo, you would say that your facts and data, were they sufficient to come to your conclusions?
Yes, they were.
Now, once you've done this research and you've collected this information, what do you do in order to finish your evaluation?
The first step first is to recreate a picture of what happened, just working backwards. That's pretty standard in my field. And what's next is to apply the psychoevaluative technique, with combining and reformulating it into the language of the courtroom. So that's then where my knowledge and experience with the criminal justice system comes into play, to help you understand whether or not the child in question was in fact violent and the appropriate steps the parent did or didn't make. That's when I can really finish the work.
And did you reliably apply that method to the facts that you had in today's case?
Absolutely.
All right, well, I want to move on and talk about what you were able to conclude.
Okay.
What did you find?
I found that
Objection as to improper opinion. The attorney has not laid sufficient foundation to qualify this expert as an expert.
What foundation do you feel is lacking?
I feel the methods need to be better laid in order for this witness to be qualified as an expert.
Response?
Your Honor, he went into significant detail about the methods that he applied. He talks about the way that he works backwards from the event to recreate exactly what happened. Once he has that picture, he applies his knowledge from his doctorate in psychology and also his knowledge of the legal system to come to conclusions about what actually applies in today's case.
May I be heard on those grounds?
You may.
Your Honor, we've never heard specific testimony as to which methods that this witness applies.
Do you have anything further?
Your Honor, I stand by my response. Dr. Solo went in extensive detail to exactly what he does when he's conducting this evaluation.
Yeah, I think I'm going to overrule. If you want to delve into it on cross-examination, feel free, but for now it'll be overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, Dr. Solo, I was just about to ask you, what were you able to find in the course of your evaluation?
I concluded that Jessie Duran, the daughter of Hayden Duran, was at serious risk for violent behavior on and before August 18th of 2010.
Now, Dr. Solo, I know that when you were explaining this to me in my office, you had a chart that you used to kind of explain what was going on. Do you think that that would be helpful to the jury in today's case?
Absolutely.
Your Honor, permission to set up the courtroom to use the demonstrative?
Yes, you may.
Your Honor, permission to move so I can see the demonstrative?
That's just fine.
All right, Dr. Solo. Would you go ahead and come up here to use it? May Dr. Solo step off his stand to...
Yes, you may.
Would you just start by kind of walking us through exactly what we're supposed to be looking at when we look at this?
Sure. This is a typical forensic psychology diagram when an adolescent is showing risk for violent behavior. The first column here details specific instances and hallmarks that increase the risk of violent behavior with the specific child, in this case, Jessie Duran. Column number 2 details the reasonable response to manage violent behavior when they're present in a child. And the third column here just details the application to the specific case, telling us what exactly Hayden Duran did, or more accurately in this case, what Hayden Duran did not do.
Okay, well, let's start at the beginning and just kind of walk through it.
Okay.
That first column that's talking about the child, what's the first thing that you can tell us that you noticed about Jessie Duran's behavior?
The first risk factor for violent behavior is exposure to violent media. Psychological data suggests that children from the ages of 5 to 17 are at severe risk and they're impressionable based on the things that they either see or hear. I found evidence to suggest that Jessie Duran had excessive and consistent exposure to violent first-person shooter games.
Let's go ahead and talk about the second one there.
Okay.
What was the second hallmark that you saw?
The second hallmark I found present was fascination with firearms. Again, that impressionism issue with youth, that was also consistent in this case with the danger of weaponry, in this case, handguns. I found multiple instances of evidence, both in extension with that video game violence and drawing pictures of guns and trying to use them to scare people away. This evidence indicates that Jessie had a fascination with firearms.
And the third hallmark that you noticed?
The third and fourth hallmark are actually kind of intertwined, but the third relates to intense anger, specifically just focusing on bursts and momentary presences of anger. I found that indicative in the disciplinary report that I got from the school, in it detailing that at multiple instances, Jessie Duran...
Improper character evidence. As clarified under Wyatt v. Alley, specific instances of a child's prior bad acts cannot be used as character evidence.
Response?
Your Honor, in this situation, we are not trying to introduce this evidence of a prior bad act to prove conformity therewith. Rather, we're trying to introduce it to prove that Hayden Duran had knowledge of Jesse Duran's tendencies and that he could have and should have acted in such a way as to prevent harm to the parks.
Okay, do you have a response to Wyatt versus Ally?
Your Honor. Your Honor, my response is the same. It is not going to show conformity therewith, but we are instead using this evidence to show that Hayden Duran had knowledge. It is extremely probative in this case because we are in fact suing Hayden Duran for negligent parental supervision.
Okay, response?
Your Honor, Wyatt v. Ally specifically states that specific prior bad acts conducted by a child have no probative value. Under those grounds, they cannot be used in order to show liability, as stated within the text of Wyatt v. Ally.
Okay, well, from what I'm looking at, that looks like it has to do with willful misconduct, so it'll be overruled.
All right, Dr. Solo, would you go back to what you were talking about, that intense anger and the loss of temper, how they're intertwined, and how you're able to determine that they were present in today's case?
Sure. I reviewed evidence, specifically the disciplinary report of Jesse Duran from the school that she attended, in it detailing that multiple instances of violence among other students, fights, one even went so far as resulting in a 5-day suspension because Sydney not only physically assaulted other children, but even went so far as to bite other kids.
All right, well, let's talk about what a reasonable parent would do in response to noticing these sorts of actions on the part of their child.
Okay.
Could you walk us through that second column?
Sure. The first response to exposure to violent media, in order to reduce that impression on the young child, is to either limit or eliminate that exposure entirely.
And what were you able to find that Hayden actually did?
I found evidence that indicated Hayden Duran did nothing to limit or remove the constant exposure to violence in the media. I'll qualify that she did make attempts to instruct Jesse that this in fact was a video game. However, that isn't good enough. The exposure to violent media doesn't just need to be clarified, it ought to be removed from children, especially at that impressionistic age.
What about the second hallmark that you saw? What should a reasonable parent do when they see a fascination with firearms in their child?
Fascination with firearms is a little bit tricky because it requires a distinction between whether or not it's a physical gun they're interested in or more just a fascination with guns generally, like drawing the picture of a gun or playing with a gun in a video game. While I commend Hayden Duran for not having a gun in the house, the inability to discipline and warn others about Jesse's fascination with fire guns is concerning.
So just to be clear, that warn there refers to warning others?
At minimum, yes. If there is a consistent fascination with firearms, especially if a parent knows another has a gun in and around that proximity, yes, a parent ought to warn the parent of their respective child's interest in firearms.
Let's talk about those last two, the intense anger and the loss of temper.
Okay.
What should a parent do if they see that their child is having these intense anger and episodes of loss of temper?
First and foremost is discipline. At least make attempts to correct that misbehavior in the child. And second, and what I recommend most strongly in this case, is to get professional help. I found no evidence to suggest that Jesse was ever evaluated by a psychological professional, something that would have greatly helped in this case.
All right, Dr. Solo, would you please take your seat again?
Sure.
Now, Dr. Solo, you told us a lot about these hallmarks and these things that were going on, but I have a question.
Okay.
What if Hayden Duran didn't see that her daughter was doing these things? What if she didn't notice?
Not noticing or I guess lack of knowledge isn't, from a psychological, forensic psychology perspective, isn't good enough. Because the child at that age is so impressionable and so susceptible to the external environment, the parent has a responsibility to recognize warning signs and to respond. But specifically with this case, I found that not only did Hayden Duran know of the multiple instances of either violence or exposure to violent media, she didn't do anything about it, and that's problematic.
When you say she didn't do anything about it, did she take steps to warn anyone around her about what was going on with her child?
No. At no point did I find evidence to suggest that she warned specifically Andy Park about Jesse's fascination with firearms and excessive violence. But I'll be honest, even if she did, I wouldn't be able to tell you that her parenting was effective. Warning others is the bare minimum that parents ought to do to safeguard other people around their children. And unfortunately, Hayden Duran never did that.
Your Honor, at this time, we have no more questions for Dr. Campbell-Solo.
Okay.
Would opposing counsel like me to take down the demonstrative?
Please do, please, John.
Cross-examination.
May I proceed?
You may.
Dr. Solo, I'd like to ask you how you came to your conclusions today.
Sure.
Now, you used 6 risk factors in evaluating Jesse Duran.
That's right.
One of those risk factors was exposure to violent media.
Correct.
In your report, you state all parents should take steps to limit their children's exposure to violent media.
Yes, limit come first, although I would prefer completely removing it. That's right.
You read Hayden Duran's affidavit in today's case.
I did.
And you are familiar with the statements there within.
Absolutely, I needed them to reach conclusions, sure.
During your investigation, you learned that Hayden Duran did not allow Jesse to play with gun accessories.
Gun accessories, yes. However, the violent